Hello. It's been a while. It's been something like a year since the last update, so I figured now's a good time to update you guys on what's new. Spoiler alert, there were setbacks. But this feels like a good time to look back a bit as I continue forward. Whether you're new or returning, thanks so much for watching. My name's Andrew and I've been trying to make a JRPG for like 20 years. Your comments and suggestions are incredibly welcoming, especially since I've been so quiet the past year. In my last devlog, I did a thing I normally don't do and dropped a few life updates. New job, juggling developing as a new father, and so on. I mentioned at the end of 2022 that the startup I was at ceased operations, but had landed a new gig. But as the proverbial saying goes, time flows like a river and history repeats. In the start of 2024, just weeks after I released that devlog, the startup I was at ceased operations. So 2024, much like 2023, was spent searching for another full-time job. I have no financial means to work on game development full-time at this stage of my life, so that means this sort of stuff unfortunately goes on the back burner from time to time. Since I upload here so infrequently and have such a small following, I suppose now's a good time to ask to like and subscribe if you'd like to follow along in my game development journey. At my reach and throughput, to be honest, it really means a lot. I'll also have links to other places you can find me below. So what did happen in 2024 for Sue? I finally added support for localization. A handful of people either asked if the game would be localized or offered to localize it. First, I'm humbled, and second, it's now officially supported. Once the game's main story is complete and everything is a bit more final, I'll try to get the game localized into as many languages as I can. As for game content, if you recall, I ended my last update mentioning I had completed Act 2. For 2024, I did start on Act 3's first dungeon, but other than a few maps, I didn't make much progress. It's here where I'd like to very suddenly shift gears and talk about the mother of all game development, Setbacks. Of course, I was hoping to have more progress on the content, employment situation aside, but something else demanded my immediate attention. A feeling that sat tucked deep in the back of my mind unperturbed. It started small, but it continued to grow until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was unhappy with the game's plot. More specifically, it had structural issues stemming from an incomplete outline and a lack of experience writing fiction. I could end the update here, but I think it's worth unpacking this a bit more. How I developed the game in its current state, how I identified and addressed these issues, and where things currently stand. Quick aside, I've actually sat on a draft for this script for about 6 months. Much of the issues mentioned have already been addressed, but I still felt determined to create this devlog because it turned into something interesting. Part of my goals in sharing these videos is to document the development process. Some of this, like my last devlog, is showing off cool features. But the other side of this is a bit more nebulous. Showing my thought process, my struggles, my setbacks, my history in making this game. I've never really talked about this last one too much, so if you'll indulge me, I'd like to reminisce a bit. On some fateful winter night in 2002, I found a bootleg version of RPG Maker 2000 and immediately decided I wanted to make an RPG. The process here was largely based on gut feelings with no clear outline. I had just finished playing Kingdom Hearts, so it took place on an island. And a JRPG wasn't complete without a best friend, so of course I needed to add a best friend. What would be their call to adventure? How about a supernatural force that teleports you off the island? I'd whimsically make a few dungeons or characters that resonated with me, and then revise content as I went. The plot was driven largely by things that I felt were cool, and for retroactive continuity I'd add some explanation that gradually got more and more convoluted. Maybe I was more inspired by Kingdom Hearts than I thought. Fast forward to sometime between the release of Gangnam Style and Harlem Shake, I released the final content update of Starless Umbra's RPG Maker 2003 edition. The game had some 20 dungeons, over 1,000 maps, and a fragmented narrative I was desperately trying to conclude. But issues piled up en masse. Even a masterclass story writer couldn't fix the elephant in the room. I had no experience making games, and I was changing as a person, so my tastes were changing too. The old game-making proverb, "make the game you want to play," continues to be my North Star, But how do you navigate this when you look back at older things with standards that continue to rise and new tools and technologies emerge while others are left stagnant in the wayside? Sometimes the best thing to do is to burn it all and start over. But before that, I do have some sponsored content. Raid, shoutout, just kidding. That joke is probably really old now. I'd like to briefly talk about my other game, Heroes of Umbra. If you're unfamiliar with Heroes, it's a networked multiplayer RPG I developed from 2012 to 2018, largely out of frustration with RPG Maker 2003's limitations. It's a platformer combining some of my favorite elements of games like MapleStory, Diablo, and Ragnarok Online. When I'm unemployed, I tend to spend time learning or applying things I've learned working full-time on fun new projects tangentially related to my existing game-making endeavors to quote-unquote boost the resume. This time around, I added self-hosted servers and server-side game data saving to Heroes of Umbra. These new changes make creating and joining servers a breeze, and I really wish I had the time and energy and resources to actually market this game. Maybe in the future I'll try to do more video content on it for now, but if it seems like something you might enjoy, please give it a try and let me know what you think. This is a wonderful way to support me, and as a small independent developer, Steam reviews go a long way. The game is $10 and all future content is always free. Sales go towards hiring artists, localizers, and so on for Starless Umbra. Speaking of which, back to Sue. I realized I didn't want to go through the painful process of constantly editing something that was more discovery-based, so I leaned into outlining for the remake. Starless Umbra started with the concept of a meandering, deadly fog known as the Umbra. Expanding on this concept, I asked myself questions like, where did the fog come from? How do people cope with its existence? How do the leaders in power address it? And a story I wanted to tell began to emerge. I had a rough timeline, outline, and list of characters, and from there, the game's first act wrote itself. Aside the friendly banter of the game's two main protagonists, world-building elements of barriers, and even the tracker profession came from Bearers of the Black Staff by Terry Brooks. I don't read nearly enough fantasy, but this book sort of rekindled my interest in reading for pleasure, and I bought it secondhand from a bookstore because I thought the cover looked cool. And aside to my aside, admitting to myself that true inspiration really just comes from combining lots of cool ideas took some time. I'm inspired by decades of media I've consumed, and the best I can do is be open about that, and not try to trick myself into thinking that story writing is something that comes from a vacuum. Anyway, my outlining ended up being pretty high level. The world-building elements felt exciting enough to draft up all of Act 1's events through an initial call to adventure. Furthermore, I had rough ideas for some of the story beats I wanted to hit after Act 1, a reunification with Ilari, some raising of the stakes, and a conclusion. By the way, don't be fooled into thinking I'm being vague here to avoid spoilers. I really had no concrete plans for the game's middle and final acts. The unfortunate truth here is that I hadn't really solidified much in the way of character motives, character arcs, or even an overarching plot arc. Act 2 in particular was intended to include some world building before Act 3's journey to Ilari segment, but it even failed to meet that basic requirement. Another big blunder with Act 2 is the fact that it does very little to advance the plot. If you haven't played or seen it, it introduces a new character from your home colony and tries to cram a mystery subplot into their inclusion. They aren't involved in future acts and the whole thing feels very side questy. Act 1 makes a promise that the story is going to be about saving a friend, and then a lot of this goes on pause. Unfortunately, my initial fix was to double down here. More cutscenes, more relationships, make this character more closely related to the other character. But none of this advances the plot arcs I had established in the first act. There's no Umbra, no Asteri, little Ilari, but worst of all, no Reen. Yet another issue here is that my motives were not at all solidified. There's Faction A, which works for this person, but they don't really trust them, so there's another faction, Faction B, that doesn't like either but wants to build a temporary alliance with Faction A, and so on and so on. At some point I had to step back and admit I had completely lost control of the story I was trying to tell by trying to make it unique rather than making it cohesive. I'd rather err on the side of telling a simple, tight narrative over something that feels bloated and convoluted for this vague notion of a truly original story experience. For Act 2, it wasn't until after outlining, writing all the dialogue, and then implementing and revising that dialogue that I had realized that things just needed to be redone. Looking back, there were clear signals that it had issues. First, in outlining future acts, I realized the core story elements that characters were pushed way late in the game. Second, beta players were less engaged in the narrative. And third, I was struggling to even explain the motives of the major factions. I decided I really need to return to the outlining phase. What are the game's factions? What are their motives? How do I progress on my plot points I promised to my players? More importantly, I needed to be comfortable with removing ideas that weren't effective or necessary. A lot of this I tried to craft from the heart, but in reality I just needed to use my brain. Sunk cost fallacy is a real thing. Heads up, I will be speaking high level here about the structure of the game's 5 planned acts. I'll of course not spoil anything, but if you haven't played the current demo, or you just want to go into this project's future acts completely blind, I completely understand if you want to skip this section. So where were we? Right, content revisions. The good news is that most of Act 1 is salvageable, with one minor change to its conclusion. The twist at the end of Act 1 is a good example of something cool I wanted to explore, but I didn't really have a clear direction for. Recall at the end of Act 1 that Ilari essentially throws Amalia off of the train. A betrayal like this feels really cool at the end of Act 1, but then I need to spend future content explaining why one of our main protagonists doesn't want to help. Was it brainwashing? Did our protagonist leave the colony to exact revenge on his brother that slaughtered his entire clan? It feels a bit like storyline debt, a strong idea that definitely needs to be explained and ultimately paid back with interest. Problem is I had no strong plan or reason for this. Oops! So it's getting reworked slightly to avoid a needless brainwashing trope so early in the game. Act 2 will also follow the same sort of town dungeon loop with some story elements removed. What you're seeing now is footage of events I've come to terms with completely killing from the narrative. It's a bit cathartic. I really wanted this arc to work, but scoping down the story here has taught me a valuable lesson in leaning more into outlining to avoid costly revisions down the way. There was even a cool combat segment here that involved toggling characters to either fight enemies or control a wagon. I'll try to bring it back later. In Pruning Act 2, I've had the space to harden character arcs. Specifically, I've defined wants and needs for the primary characters. This slight incongruity between these two adds depth, and brings a flavor of character growth to the plot. By the way, I'm sorry if this is obvious. I'm sure anyone who's written any fiction is rolling their eyes in the back of their head. But for me, all of this time I've spent trying to write a character-driven RPG, I'd never consciously considered any of this. Again, my process to this point, if you can even call it a process, was trial and error. Keep trying things and fail enough to know what not to do, and then maybe it's done properly. The problem is this revision is costly and more difficult, especially as the game grows in size. But at least now I have interesting backstories and arcs for characters outlined into the narrative in more meaningful ways. The revised Act 2 is planned to have more Umbra, the removal of superfluous characters, introduces characters that actually matter more, and most importantly, more Reen. Act 3 is a beefy one, but I feel more confident now in its direction. Because a lot of the world-building elements are moving to Act 2 in lieu of content, Act 3 stands on its own as a solid, travel-oriented chapter. The 2 major viewpoints introduced so far will merge, and a 3rd viewpoint will also be introduced. This is one I've been excited to implement, but I want to make sure that I get it right. I don't want to speak on Act 4 or 5, but broadly speaking, Act 4, the stakes are raised higher. Characters rise from low points, march towards a conclusion where there's a major battle, character arcs wrap up, and so on. I've outlined story beats and major locations there, but there's some opportunity to be flexible where it won't come at the expense of the game's narrative. And so I ended 2024 realizing that the game's plot just wasn't working and I had to cut or severely revise over half the game's content. It's unfortunate, but I really want to release something I'm proud of. And even though I've done this for a while now, there's still much for me to learn. 2025 kicked off further from the finish line than 2024, but I've accepted it now. It's not the destination, but the journey, etc., etc. And on a positive note, I've already reaped many of the benefits of this restructuring, going midway into 2025 now. A lot of the writing for Act 2 now feels like it did writing Act 1. More effortless, more rewarding, more enjoyable. Outlines are great, discovery writing isn't for me, I've seen the light. 2025 also brought about a perspective shift for me as a developer. This project, despite taking a substantial part of my life, is not the magnum opus I thought it would be, and that's for the better. I do want to continue making games, and that means learning how to be more efficient. It's just efficiencies aside, I do not want to compromise on my vision or release something I'm not satisfied with myself. Thanks for listening to me ramble for a bit, and I hope you found this somewhat interesting. This one was difficult for me to write since I actually started drafting a script for this at the end of 2024, but found myself spending my free time on the game instead of sharing updates. Let me know what you think, what you'd like to see more of, or anything else I can touch on in the next update. One positive out of my hypercritical adventure trying to do this whole game making thing for so long is that I'm very receptive to feedback. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to your thoughts. And hey, I wanted to give a special and very belated shout out to all of my Ko-Fi supporters last year. Ko-Fi? Coffee? Graydon, Vinternex, Carrot Gaz, Seraphiel. Thanks a bunch. You guys rule. I've been thinking a lot about this quote from Sarah Davis Baker's "The Internet Used to Be a Place" video essay. The things that make us feel the most human are the least compatible with profit. This game development thing is what makes me feel the most human, and even though I've never been financially motivated, I can't expect the same for those who contribute their time and energy to help out to also share that same sentiment. These donations do help with out-of-pocket expenses hiring artists, translators, and others to make this project the best it can be, so thank you so much for believing in my work enough to help me out financially, no matter the amount. Thanks and take care.